Her name was Margaret Hayes, and she was 28 years old. Every morning at 7:30, she worked the early shift at Anderson's Cafe, a modest neighborhood coffee shop with large windows that let in the gentle morning light. The cafe had wooden tables worn smooth by years of use, and the smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air. Margaret had kind eyes and wore her light brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She always dressed modestly in a cream-colored blouse and a dark skirt, practical clothes for a long day of work. She wasn't chasing dreams of anything grand. She was simply trying to make ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck in a small apartment across town. But Margaret had something money couldn't buy. She had a gentle heart. Every morning, without fail, an elderly gentleman came through those cafe doors. His name was Thomas Reed, and he was 83 years old. Thomas had a weathered face that spoke of a long life fully lived, deep lines around his eyes that came from years of both laughter and sorrow. He wore simple clothes, a gray cardigan that had seen better days, brown slacks, and a flat cap that he always removed when he entered. Thomas always sat at the same table by the window. He'd order the same thing, black coffee and a blueberry muffin. And every morning his hands would shake slightly as he tried to butter that muffin. Most people didn't notice. Or perhaps they noticed and looked away, uncomfortable with the struggles of age. But Margaret noticed. And more than that, she cared. The first time she helped him, it was simple. She brought his order to the table, and when she saw him struggling, she quietly asked, "Mr. Reed, would you mind if I helped you with that?" Thomas looked up at her, surprised. There was a moment of pride fighting with need in his eyes. Then he smiled softly and nodded. "That's very kind of you, young lady," he said, his voice quiet. Margaret gently took the knife and buttered his muffin, spreading it evenly the way she imagined he might like it. She cut it into quarters, making it easier for him to handle. "There you go," she said with a warm smile. "Thank you," Thomas replied, and there was something in his voice beyond gratitude. Perhaps it was relief, or maybe it was simply the comfort of being seen. That became their morning ritual. Every day, Margaret would bring Thomas his coffee and muffin. Every day, she would help him butter it, cut it into pieces, and sometimes, if the cafe wasn't too busy, she would sit with him for a few minutes. They talked about simple things, the weather, the changing seasons, old memories Thomas shared about his late wife, Dorothy, who had passed 5 years ago. "Dorothy made the best apple pie," Thomas would say, his eyes distant with memory. "She'd put a little cinnamon in the crust. That was her secret." Margaret would listen, really listen, in a way that made Thomas feel less alone in the world. 3 months passed this way. The other waitresses noticed but never joined in. The manager never said anything as long as the work got done. And Thomas, who lived in a small assisted living facility nearby, began to look forward to his mornings at the cafe. To him, Margaret wasn't just a waitress. She was a bright spot in days that otherwise felt long and lonely. Then one Thursday morning, everything changed. Margaret was in the middle of helping Thomas with his breakfast when the cafe door opened. A man walked in, tall and confident, probably in his mid-30s. He wore an expensive navy blue suit, perfectly tailored with a crisp white shirt and a silk tie. His dark hair was styled with care, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone used to being in charge. Behind him came 2 others, a man and a woman, both carrying leather briefcases, both dressed in the formal attire of lawyers. Margaret glanced up briefly, then returned her attention to Thomas, carefully cutting his muffin. But she felt the energy in the room shift. The man in the suit stopped at their table. His eyes moved from his grandfather to Margaret, and his expression was hard to read. "Grandfather," he said, his voice controlled but firm. Thomas looked up, and Margaret saw surprise cross his face, followed by something that might have been worry. "David," Thomas said quietly. "What are you doing here?" David Reed looked at his grandfather, and then his eyes settled on Margaret. There was something assessing in his gaze. "I came because the staff at Riverside Residence called me. They said you've been coming here every morning, spending money you don't have. They're concerned." Margaret felt her heart sink. She gently set down the knife and started to stand, sensing she should give them privacy. "Please don't go," Thomas said quickly, reaching out to touch her hand. "This is Margaret. She's been very kind to me." David's jaw tightened. He looked at Margaret with an expression that seemed to mix suspicion with something else, perhaps concern. "I'm sure she has," he said, and there was an edge to his words. "Ms. Hayes, Margaret Hayes," she replied, meeting his eyes. "I'm just the waitress here, Mr. Reed. I've been helping your grandfather with his breakfast." "I can see that," David said. He gestured to the two lawyers behind him. "This is Richard Morrison and Jennifer Chen. They're attorneys. We need to discuss some family matters." Margaret felt a cold wave of dread. She'd heard stories about situations like this, about people who preyed on the elderly, and now this grandson thought she was one of them. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said quietly but firmly. "I've just been helping your grandfather eat his breakfast." "For 3 months," David said. "Every single day. The staff told me. They also told me you're the only one he talks about, that he's been giving you tips far beyond what's appropriate." Margaret's cheeks flushed. It was true that Thomas had been generous, leaving her $10 or $20 most mornings, far more than the cost of his meal. But she'd never asked for it, and several times she'd tried to refuse. "I never asked him for anything," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "She didn't," Thomas said, his voice stronger than Margaret had heard it in weeks. "David, you're making a mistake here." But David held up his hand. "Grandfather, please. I know you're lonely since Grandma passed. I know I haven't visited as much as I should. But I can't let someone take advantage of you." "No one is taking advantage," Thomas said. But David was already gesturing to the lawyers. "Mr. Morrison has prepared some paperwork," David said, and the male lawyer opened his briefcase. "We need to discuss your finances, grandfather, and ensure that no one has been manipulating you." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. This wasn't right. She'd only been trying to help, to show a lonely old man some kindness. "I should go," she whispered. "No," Thomas said firmly. He looked at his grandson with an expression that was part disappointment, part determination. "David, sit down. If you're going to do this, at least hear me out." David hesitated, then pulled out a chair and sat. The two lawyers remained standing, awkward witnesses to a family moment. "I'm 83 years old," Thomas began, his voice steady. "Your grandmother died 5 years ago, and I moved into that facility because you and your mother insisted. You said it was for my own good, and maybe it was. But do you know what it's like there, David? Do you know what my days are like?" David's expression softened slightly. "Grandfather, I wake up at 6, Thomas continued. I eat breakfast in a dining room with 50 other people, most of whom can't remember my name from one day to the next. I sit in a room and watch television shows I don't care about. Twice a week, someone leads us in exercises that make me feel more broken than before. And then I go to bed. That's my life, David. That's every single day." Margaret stood quietly, her hand still resting on the back of Thomas's chair. "Except for my mornings here," Thomas said, and his voice grew gentler. "Except for these 2 hours every day when I walk to this cafe, and I sit at this table, and I have my coffee and my muffin. And this young woman, this kind young woman, helps me. Not because she has to, not because I'm paying her, but because she sees me, David. She sees me as a person, not as a problem to be managed or a liability to be protected." There was silence in the cafe. Even the other customers had stopped talking, sensing the weight of the moment. David looked at Margaret, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. "Is this true?" he asked her. "You've just been helping him eat?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "That's all. He reminds me of my grandfather, who passed away 3 years ago. I used to help him too, near the end. I know how hard it can be, losing the ability to do simple things. I just wanted to help." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to the lawyers. "Give us a moment." "Please," he said. The two attorneys exchanged glances, then nodded and moved to a table across the cafe. David leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the table. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, tinged with something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry," he said, first to Margaret, then to his grandfather. "I thought, when they called me, I assumed the worst. I thought someone was scamming you, grandfather. I was trying to protect you." "I know," Thomas said quietly. But sometimes, David, protection can feel like a cage. David nodded slowly. He looked at Margaret again. How much has he been tipping you? He asked. Margaret hesitated. I don't keep track. Maybe $10 or $20 most days. But I never asked for it, Mr. Reed. He insisted. Please, call me David, he said. He was quiet for another moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Miss Hayes, Margaret, I owe you an apology, a real one. You've been doing something I should have been doing. You've been giving my grandfather your time and your kindness, and I walked in here ready to accuse you of a crime, when the only thing you're guilty of is being a better person than most. Margaret felt the tension. In her chest began to ease. David reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. He took out a business card and slid it across the table to Margaret. I own a property management company, he said. I have a position opening up next month for an assistant manager at one of my residential buildings. It pays $45,000 a year with benefits. If you're interested, call me. Margaret stared at the card, unable to speak. You don't have to decide now, David continued. But someone who shows this kind of character, who treats people with this kind of dignity, that's someone I want working for me. I don't know what to say, Margaret whispered. Say you'll think about it, David replied. He turned to his grandfather. And you, grandfather? I'm sorry I haven't been visiting. I'm sorry I let work and life get in the way of what matters. That change is starting now. How about I join you for coffee tomorrow morning? If Margaret doesn't mind an extra customer, Thomas's eyes were bright with emotion. I'd like that very much. Margaret smiled, blinking back tears. You're both always welcome. David stood and called the lawyers over. We're done here, he told them. Everything's fine. Send me your bill. The attorneys left, looking somewhat confused but professional as always. David shook Margaret's hand. Thank you, he said sincerely, for seeing my grandfather, for caring. It was never a burden, Margaret said. It was a privilege. David left shortly after, but not before embracing his grandfather and promising to return the next day. When he was gone, Thomas looked at Margaret with a smile that seemed to take years off his face. You see, he said, kindness has a way of coming back around. Margaret sat down across from him, her shift temporarily forgotten. I was just helping, she said. That's all. That's everything, Thomas replied. 3 weeks later, Margaret started her new job. But she still came to Anderson's cafe every morning before work at 7:30 to have coffee with Thomas. And most mornings now, David was there too, learning about his grandfather's life, hearing stories about Dorothy and the apple pie with cinnamon in the crust. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest changes. Not because we expect anything in return, but because kindness has a way of opening doors we didn't even know were closed. And sometimes, helping someone butter their muffin is the most important thing you can do in a day. That's the truth Margaret learned, and it's a truth worth remembering.